Great.
All right. We are live, Dad.
Awesome.
Thank you for making time to chat.
Sure.
To those on YouTube, thank you for joining us. We're gonna take some questions at the end, but for now, let's jump in with Dad. Would you introduce yourself to us, please?
Yeah, and also, Dave, before I do introduction, do you want to remind people about if they have questions, then they should do
Oh
what?
yeah. Yep. Yeah. So if you have questions, please use the YouTube chat to pose your question. Or if you just want to say hi, that's great too. And like I said, at the end, we will field those questions. So ask them as you have them.
Okay. Thanks, David. Okay, so back to me. So let me start out with a little bit of introduction. Of course, David McCandless knows the introduction, but for the rest of you, I'm Mike McCandless. I think David said this, but David and I are related. And so I've been in the IT business or information technology services business for 25 plus years. Um, in terms of contracts or what I'll refer to as statements of work, I think I've read or written hundreds of those. The largest client that I've had him at any one time was annually about $29 million. I've managed a portfolio of a set of clients of $70 million, and the actually the largest client from the company standpoint that I ever did business with was a global retailer located in Bentonville, Arkansas. I think it's obviously that is. Hey, but good news for you folks on the call. I've made mistakes during the year or during my time. I hopefully will share during the call and help you avoid some of those same mistakes. So, David, that's the introduction.
Yeah. Well, I can testify personally that my dad, he's taught me a ton about business, probably more than any other human on the face of the planet, as well as specifically about contracts. He has helped me learn a lot of lessons and saved me some pain and frustration. Um, and outside of your experience as an IT rock star, what what do you enjoy, Dad?
Um, in no particular order, seeing the kids, seeing the grandkids, riding a bike, walking a dog, and as you'll see in I think the next set of slides, some activity that I was engaged in the last 12 months, renovating a house.
Nice. Well, without further ado, I think you have some content to share.
Okay, yeah,
So
let me do the and see it's being live streamed. So that's fine. I'm going to share content, share my screen, start the broadcast. Okay, so David, are you looking at PowerPoint?
yep.
Okay. All right. So I previewed this during my introduction when David said, "Hey, what do you like to do?" So this is a before on the left-hand side and after, not completely after, but same house, same place. Uh, this is uh, this is a home that my wife and I own, located close to some of the grandchildren. The reason that I share this with you is, one, I like to begin discussions with an engaging picture. Also, I thought that there's some lessons here, or at least parallels between what went on that took us from what's on the left to what's on the right. Interesting tidbit for you, the house was built in 1925. So what's the point here of showing you these two pictures? Well, a couple of things. One, that when we began this undertaking, that actually probably the before picture I should have showed you was the house being gutted or in a gutted state. An undertaking of that magnitude required a written agreement, and we did have a written agreement with the contractor. It had scope, schedule, communication process, price, invoicing, acceptance, etc. Mm-hmm. Also, because my business is not renovating houses, and we didn't think we could think of everything up front, we relied on a change process, which was documented in the agreement, and a positive relationship with the contractor. I'm fully believe that without the agreement we had in place and the relationship, we would have been both set up for failure and frustration. So a lot of the things that we did with the house, I'm going to talk to you about when we consider a statement of work. And I started out with the house because I think or imagine that many of you who are on this call today, if I said to you, hey, I want you to take a gutted house and then take it to completion, which I showed you, you would never think about doing that with some form of agreement that dealt with schedule, scope, price, status, except you'd just be like, why would I do that? That would be crazy. And so I think the same conclusion applies when we take on projects, whether they're in IT or their business or data and analytics, without some agreement in place. You just set yourself up for failure and frustration. Now, a statement of work is not going to change your life completely. It's not going to fix world hunger. It's not going to fix things in the ocean, but it will save you failure and frustration most of the time. So let me stop sharing PowerPoint, and I'm going to switch to instead, bear with me, this. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start here with the context here is going to be a statement of work. Okay. A statement of work is what I've used over the past 25 plus years, which is that agreement. And we'll talk about what's in that agreement. It's the agreement that I have put in place with the client to try and avoid that pain and frustration. Okay. What I've got in the table here is, I don't think I'm going to hit all these here, but if I look at when a project is executing, when I look at that from the client's perspective, and then from the consultant's perspective, sometimes they're very well aligned. Sometimes I don't think they're entirely well aligned. Let me take a couple of these for you. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these. And the material that I'm sharing here, minus the pictures of our house, will be available. David will put that somewhere you can get to it. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the second row here. The client feels like, hey, my core competency is not technology, it's not project management. That's why we brought you on as the consultant. You're the expert. That's why you're here. Okay. And in my experience, that's a pretty fair perspective of the customer. However, what you have to be aware of, and I've been bit by this before, is that in cases, you may run into cases where there may not have been something written. There may not have been clarity or alignment on something. And I'll give you an example from the house. But the client is going to say, well, you're the consultant. I mean, you should have known better. You do this for a living, right? And certainly if you had a concern, you would have told me about that. And since you didn't, it's obviously your fault. So let me give you an example. On our house, on the garage, there was no gutter there. And the house is actually in Iowa. So it gets cold in the winter and there's a lot of snow. So what happens on the roof without a gutter, the water drains off of the roof. And unfortunately, it was going to drain right onto a sidewalk, which was used for people to walk from the garage to the house. And I said, I think this is just going to create a big skating rink and people are going to slip and fall if we don't put a gutter there. Now, the gutter was not a part of the agreement. And the contractor said, yeah, we probably should have put that in there. We'll put a gutter in. So my point on this one is that while I've always seen alignment between client and consultant on, I'm the expert, you brought me in for a reason. Just bear in mind that the client is also going to have the perspective, you're the expert, so you know better than I, and in cases of where something's not clear, you would tell me. Okay. Fourth item, time and materials is, or paying by the hour. That's just a billing method. The consultant is going to deliver the project at a cost less than or equal to the estimated cost or within a reasonable price range. Say, for example, plus or minus 10%. Fair perspective, that needs to be documented and clearly explained in the statement of work about what is going to be the price, how is it going to change, how close is it going to be to what the estimate is, could it be within a price range? Okay. So that's something that the statement of work would cover. I'll skip to the next to the bottom. I need a weekly summary of status, fact-based, and I don't have time or ability to dig it out of your project schedule document, aka Excel, aka Smartsheets, aka MS Project, whatever. Just tell me what I need to know and act on. I don't have time to figure it out. I have seen cases, unfortunately, too many times where this perspective is not shared. There's a bunch of detail that the consultant wants to share with the client. And I've heard the client say many times before, if something's green, I don't need to hear about it. I just need you to tell me where the problems are and what I need to do about it. Well, the statement of work should have, and we'll talk about the section, should have a section in it that deals with the communications management process, which will deal with this perspective. Okay. I didn't cover all these. Again, David will share this in the document. The point of having this table was to sort of set up, well, what's the problems or what's the solution that a statement of work is going to provide? Before I go on, any questions, David?
I don't think so. No, sir.
Okay. All right. Let's go on next to what is in a statement of work. Okay. And I'm not being prescriptive here. I'm not saying this is the only answer that you could come up with. But I'm trying to give you what I have seen to be the typical sections, and then some commentary around that. Okay. Background. This is probably the easiest section that you would ever write. The client understands the background. There's going to be, the only disagreement would be here is if you don't get it right. This is the easiest section to write.
This is like, why are we doing this project?
Yeah, exactly. How did we get here? Next one is scope. I think this is probably a well understood, everybody should describe what scope is. Sometimes, and again, I've seen this, sometimes scope describes what is in scope. and doesn't describe what's out of scope. Okay. And this is a case where you can get into trouble, where you may say, well, if it's not in scope, it's clearly out of scope.
Mm-hmm.
And the customer may feel like, well, you didn't document it, so it obviously could have been in scope. So for items that could be large in effort and or cost, I try, and that would be project specific, I like to include what's out of scope as well as what's in scope.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, I have seen plenty of SOWs that say whatever's not in scope is out of scope.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, deliverables. This is what the partner is producing, and it's what the client is paying for. Now, there are statements of work where a consultant is simply providing hours.
And Dad, on scope, when you've specified a few examples of what's out of scope, how often does that turn into the customer saying, "Oh, I thought that was in scope. You need to add that to stuff in scope"?
I wouldn't say that happens all the time, but it's not uncommon either. Or it could be, hey, I hadn't really thought of, I hadn't thought about that. Boy, you're right. I guess we are going to have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So possible, not all the time.
Mm-hmm.
For the deliverables, I like to name the deliverable and provide a description. If this is a deliverable you've produced many times in the past, you can get extra points and save yourself some frustration if you provide an example of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if David was going to create a deliverable, which was a
dashboard,
a dashboard, there's a lot of variety as to what that could look like. And again, this comes back to clients don't do this for a living. So while you may understand what a deliverable is, they probably won't. And so that's why I was suggesting if you have an example, include it. I would be careful on the deliverables section to not include too many. I try and limit it to 10. I'm going to explain why a little bit further down. Okay. Schedule. Think Gantt chart. Okay. Horizontal bars defining a begin and an end date. Okay. This doesn't have to be and should not be your detailed project schedule, preferably that you're tracking somewhere else, but it should summarize it. Mm-hmm. This should give the client a sense of, oh, okay, I understand when this next phase or this next task or this next activity is going to begin. Okay, this should remove or give some granularity to, we started here, we ended here. What sort of happened in the middle? Okay, if you think back to my housing example, we had framing, painting, plumbing. Actually, I screwed up the order there. Drywall should have been in there to begin with. Mm-hmm. So those major chunks of work, that's what gets put out on the schedule. And again, sort of, David, to your earlier question, I find this to be a great case where the client goes, oh, well, that's not going to work. This is too short. We'll never get it done in this amount of time. Or, oh, wait a minute, we've got this other dependency with, like this is the busiest time of the year for us. This will never happen. Or we've got this other project dependency. We can't go live then. Mm-hmm. So it's a good tool to get acceptance or get alignment on what you're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. Okay. Roles and responsibilities. This just talks about what are the key roles that are going to be on the project. Client probably understands what they're going to bring to the table, but again, this isn't what they do for a living. And so they're going to be curious about how many people are you bringing? What is their role going to be? Should we think about in terms of what their responsibilities are? I think it's overkill to include every last role in the statement of work, although I've seen it before. I think the key here is to include what are the key leadership roles and what are their responsibilities. Okay. Acceptance management. This is an important one. This is something David and I have talked about many times before. And I don't want people to get concerned about or freaked out about. So acceptance management just it's the process of how deliverables get accepted. And since in most cases, acceptance relates to invoicing, in other words, I completed deliverable. I say to you, Mr. Client, hey, I'm done. I need you to accept this. And once they do, okay, I'm going to invoice you now. Because acceptance and invoice are typically tied together, or can be, this is an important section to pay attention to. But it's really pretty simple. It's what's the process you get of how you get acceptance for deliverables. You need to include who accepts it, what's the time frame between, hey, David, here's a deliverable. I need you to accept that. David needs to have an agreed to time frame that he's going to reply to me, hey, Michael, it's either accepted or rejected. That can't be open-ended. Okay. I would love it if clients accepted or rejected within 3 business days. That typically doesn't work out. I would say 5 days is pretty reasonable and typical. I had a project last year where the client wanted 20 days, and there was a reason. It was a fairly good reason. So it needs to include who accepts, what's the time frame, and an important point is deemed acceptance. And again, David and I have talked about this before, but here's what this means. If I give David a deliverable, and let's say that our time frame, our agreed time frame is 5 business days. So let's say it's Monday. On Monday, I give David a deliverable. Here, David, I need you to accept or reject this. David doesn't do anything. David's really tied up that week, or David just doesn't do anything. I don't get anything back from David on Friday. Well, 5 business days have passed. Deemed acceptance means if the client doesn't provide an accept or reject response, it's by default accepted. And this is important because you can run into cases where you define acceptance, an acceptance period. The client never accepts it. And when you try and invoice, they come back and say to you, well, I never accepted it. Well, right, you never accepted it. That's because I never got anything from you. Well, you never submitted it. Yeah, I did submit it. This just cut short that whole loop around, I submitted, no, you didn't. Anyway, deemed acceptance, very important. I'll pause there for a second before I keep going. Any questions, David?
No questions from my end or from the chat yet.
Okay.
But that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Change management. Remember how I said to you in my housing example, I don't renovate houses for a living. And my wife would tell you that I don't really have the best ability to visualize what it's going to look like at the end. And I think most clients are the same way. They don't know what they don't know. So when you tell them, hey, we're going to have this, session where we're going to outline a backlog, or we're going to have requirements, and then that's it. We're through. It's not really the way it works. And so you need a change management process that says, hey, something came up. It's not bad or good, but something came up. We need to recognize that there's a change, and we need to have a process that's going to memorialize what it is that changed. And this is normally not anything that clients push back on because they recognize that change does happen.
Yeah.
I would say what I have seen more problematic is a consultant may say, oh, we have a change. And the client goes, well, that's not a change, that's a clarification. And clearly, you, Mr. Consultant, who've been in this business for X number of years, if you would know better, right? You should know we would have this. This is clearly a clarification. I've seen that be a problem. I've seen when consultant goes to client and says, this is a defect. No, this is not a defect. Again, this is a clarification. Or, well, you're right, this is a new requirement. Well, and of course, it's a new requirement. And so we've got to preserve the end date. So you got to do it anyway. So short version here, change management, the process, not that hard. I don't think you'll have difficulty getting people to agree to it. There's some nuances around what is a change versus what's not. Okay. Communication management. This is simple.
And would you say that it's the minority of times where, in your experience, customers disagree that this is a change which requires an addendum versus, oh no, this is in scope. I already paid for this.
I think I'll give you the consulting answer. It really depends, David. We'll talk, I think, a little bit later on about estimating assumptions.
Yeah.
Putting in the statement of work. I mean, so David, when you have a project, if customer says, I want you to create, I'm making it up, 5 dashboards, you have a underlying set of assumptions that allow you to come back with, okay, that's going to take, I'm making it up, 100 hours and it's going to cost you $1 million. Okay. Mm-hmm. Those underlying assumptions that you're making need to be put into the statement of work, because if you don't, then when David says, well, you know what, to get that 5th dashboard, we assumed that there would be 10 interfaces, but it turns out there's 50. If that's not put into the document, it's going to be very hard for David and the client to agree on what's a change. And in most cases, what I've found is the client goes, you didn't document it, so sorry, not my fault. So, but in cases, David, where estimating assumptions are well documented, and remember, the client reviews this document probably multiple times before signing, then change isn't so hard. I do find that the change is hard when you're into a testing phase, and there's a difference between what client sees as clarification or new requirement. And anyway, depends. Communication. This is really simple. It just talks about what are the regular status meetings and who's going to be attending. It's really that simple. Having said that, my experience is that most projects fail because of communication, not because of technical reasons. We'll talk about some of the potential problem areas that you can see, sort of the smoke on the horizon, if you will, before the train runs over the cliff. But the communication management section is very simple. Fees, billing, and estimating assumptions. I talked about this a little bit. Normally, fees and billing, that's really not that hard. You either fix price or it's a time materials arrangement. But being able to explain it.
Or gain sharing.
Okay, it could be gain sharing as well, which I would say is exceedingly complicated.
Yeah.
Simple to talk about, harder to execute.
Yeah.
And again, I talked about the estimating assumptions. I think if you don't put estimating assumptions in, your ability to get change accepted will be very difficult. Okay. Termination. So this deals with the possibility that something might change on the client side. they may go a different direction. There may be a different change in leadership. It's nothing bad. The consultant hasn't done anything wrong. It's just that something very material changed on the client side. And so they're going to ask for the ability to terminate for convenience the project that you've got going on, which is a very reasonable request. What you've got to decide is what's the time frame or for the notice period. Is it 2 weeks? Is it 4 weeks? Is it 1 day? That is going to depend upon how much investment. So let's say David is, if David has invested, let's say 2 weeks of effort prior to the engagement ever starting, he needs to recover that. Or if he has, if David's not sure about being able to reassign people quickly, then he's going to want some runway for that termination for convenience. So term for convenience is a very reasonable expectation from the client, but you need to define what that time frame is. Okay. Acceptance criteria. This is sort of.
Have you ever seen termination happen in your 25 years? Or like how often? Like 1% of the time, 5% of the time?
I was some low single digits for sure. I would say it normally occurs because of negative changes in the client's business environment.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the client is trying to save money. And one of the ways to do that is to shut down projects.
Yeah.
So we talked about acceptance management. Acceptance criteria is a part of that. Now, this is simple in concept. I don't think it's really that difficult either in practice. But acceptance criteria just basically answers the question, when is it done? Right? So if you think about, you take your car to the Jiffy Lube or the Valvoline Center for an oil change, what would be the acceptance criteria? Well, the old oil should have been drained. The new oil should have been put in. The dipstick, when it came back out, should have registered that it was at the appropriate range of fullness. That's acceptance criteria. Okay. And my example of changing the oil of your car is somewhat simple. And even if I went to the Jiffy Lube and said change the oil, I don't think we would really worry about it because we get it done. They do it all the time. But for technology projects, remember, the client doesn't do this all the time. They're not familiar with the deliverables. You may not have worked with them before. So having language that says, when's this going to be done is really important.
Yeah.
Let me tell you one that I have seen many, many times in the draft from my side. Oh, acceptance criteria. That means we'll put the deliverables accepted when the client accepts it. Now, other than that being recursive, it just doesn't work. You might as well not have put anything. Okay, that is acceptance criteria. Let me go to the last section here, and then I think, David, you may have had some questions. So
yeah, for acceptance criteria, so do you find that there's earlier you mentioned this can be hard in testing phase related to change management. Do you find there's a part of the project where acceptance criteria is the hardest to nail down?
Yeah, I do. And I wouldn't say it's a part of the project. I would say it's more related to what the deliverable is. The closer you get to code or execution or production, the easier it is to define. The further away you get from there, meaning your deliverable is a paper document, a set of slides, the harder it is.
Yeah.
Now, harder doesn't mean you shouldn't have criteria. It just means harder.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some smoke signals that there may be problems that are coming. And remember, I said further towards the top, in my experience, projects typically fail because of, or are challenged because of communication problems. It's not because, I'm making this up, because Redshift couldn't perform, or that somebody, couldn't tune an S3 bucket, or that Lambda wasn't working fast enough. It was typically communication problems. So some of the smoke signals that I have seen before that may indicate that there's a problem is that there's no recurring scheduled status meeting. I would tell any client, if you're not having a weekly status meeting with your contractor, then what's happening? That is a problem. When I think back to our housing example, as a part of the agreement we had a weekly standing status meeting with the contractor. Okay. So if there's not a status meeting, huge flashing red light. Now, if you've got past that, you're having a status meeting, some of the things that you might be missing could cause a problem. If the status is more activity oriented, we onboarded 3 people, we ran 25 test cases, we had 5 requirement meetings, we updated our Jira board. If activities make up the majority of describing status, that's typically a problem. You would expect that early on, like first week or 2. But once that happened, once you're past that, remember what the client's paying for: deliverables. They're not paying for the activity that it takes to get there.
Yeah.
So okay. Project issues. There's nothing wrong with projects or having project issues. Every project has issues. In fact, I would tell you, I have questioned people on a status report before. Where's the issues? Oh, we don't have any issues. Really? I don't believe that. So when you have issues that don't have an owner, or don't have a target date, or don't have some statement of, hey, if we don't resolve this by this date, here's what's going to happen, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Because if you have issues identified with no owner or target date, again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. If you ever want to go to the client and say, hey, we had a problem with XYZ issue, client's going to say, you're the expert. You're the one who's, giving me status. If you wanted me to do something, you should have told me that. And you didn't. So obviously it's your fault. Third one, I think is a big deal. Lack of visibility to what has been spent versus what is already been spent versus what's remaining to be spent. I guarantee you, client had to go get approval from somewhere to fund this project. And as a part of that approval, there was a dollar amount that went with it. And if this project runs over that number, it will be, in general, not good. So client would be very interested to understand, are we coming in at or below?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a couple, escalation. I used to tell this, David's heard this many times. Escalation is not a bad thing. It by itself, it is not a bad thing. It is a cry for help. We have hit a situation where the people engaged cannot resolve this. We need external influence to resolve this. When escalation doesn't happen, that should be a warning sign. And then the last one I will talk, we spoke about acceptance. I've talked about that a number of times, but when I submit to David a deliverable and our time frame is 5 days, and David is regularly taking 7, 8, 10 days, or completely relying on deemed acceptance, it either means David's very busy, or there may be something else going on. I would be concerned if there were regular delays with acceptance. Okay, David, that is the end of my prepared material. I'm going to remember to stop sharing now.
Yeah.
Did I stop sharing?
You have stopped sharing. Congratulations.
Okay, great. So let's turn to questions, either David that you had or questions that have come from the group.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dad, for the rapid primer on not just writing contracts, but how to ensure projects are a success. Yeah, how to write language up front, and then also how to manage to ensure success and happiness for both sides. We don't have any questions from the YouTube chat yet, so I will ask you some of my questions.
Okay.
So, and one of the things I'd love to hear are stories from your 25 plus years of experience. So, we talked about earlier, what if there's disagreement about if there's a change or not, and how to resolve that. So could you tell us a story about a time where there is some disagreement about change with a customer, and how did y'all end up resolving that?
Sure. So I'll give you an example, David, of actually same client, same project. It was a case, or I guess you'd call it a tale of two cities. So there was one case where we handled it poorly, or I should say, getting agreement to change was very difficult. And then the other case where it worked well. So I'll start out with what worked well.
Yeah.
We had done a good job in estimating assumptions of identifying at a table level. And this was a project that was moving, a data modernization project, moving from an on-prem database to Redshift. And we had done a good job of saying in the source layer, here's the 335 tables that we're going to migrate to Redshift. So so not only had we quantified the total, we had identified the actual table names. Okay. And so later on in the project, when there was an ask to, hey, and this was a fixed bid project too, by the way. Later on in the project, when the client said, hey, we need to, you to add XYZ number of more tables, we were able to say, hey, we were very clear.
Yeah.
These 335 is what we agreed to. There was no mystery here. It was part of the document. So we're happy to add more tables, and it'll cost X amount more. So that was the case where I felt like we did exactly the right thing.
Yeah.
Now, same project, same client. Where we didn't do as well was project started, and due to, I won't go into it, but due to some factors, the approach that we were going to take for the migration changed. Okay. The initial approach that we had thought about taking was clear it was not going to work, especially in the time frame that we had. And so we agreed, keyword verbally, with the client, hey, we said we were going to take approach A, we're going to take approach B. Everybody was aligned, and we went merrily on with approach B. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The problem was new client leader comes in, reads the statement of work, and says, I think what you guys are doing does not match at all what the statement of work says. Like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, good news, Mr. New Client. We actually had these conversations. We've aligned on the approach. Oh, okay, but where's that in writing? I don't see that. So that became a disagreement point, which I'll say in the end got resolved.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the price. I mean, we gave the client a number that said, we think this is what you owe us. They came back to us and said, oh, no, you're wrong. This is what you owe us. We ended up settling sort of in the middle to the tune of several $100,000 that we gave back as a credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the point of that was, it was a happy ending. The project got put into production. There was value created from it, but it cost us money that we really didn't have to pay if we had just done a better job of documenting what the change was. And I guarantee you, in our statement of work, it said what the change process was. We just didn't follow it.
Mm-hmm. One thing to write the procedure, another thing to follow it.
Yeah. Yep.
So speaking of legal language, um, you've said before how falling back on legal language should be like a last resort.
Right.
And ideally, you should have enough trust you can resolve issues with your customers without inspecting the legal language together. So tell us a story about a time when you were able to resolve resolve a conflict with a customer without having to hold their toes to the legal fire.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah, I do have a good story for that, David, but I really want to have the group hear the point that you said of, if you have to be pulling out the contract to resolve the problem, you're at a bad state.
Mm-hmm.
Right then. That is the last resort and the worst case scenario that you want to be in. So I had a client doing about $30 million a year. And in the fourth quarter, which for us was October, November, December, at the beginning of that period, they came to us and said, hey, we've had some business conditions change on our side, and we need some help from you. And the help that we need from you is that, let me do it in, I'll say 36 million, because this will be easier math.
Yeah.
So 36 million a year, roughly $3 million a month. Client comes to us and says, we want that $3 million in Q4 to go away. We want it to be zero. Now, we don't want you to change what you're doing, of course. We want to enjoy the same services, but that $3 million that you would have invoiced for, we want that to be zero. And of course, we've had a long-standing positive relationship. We would view this favorably if you would support us on this, but please take out $3 million of cost. Now, there was zero question in my mind that I could go to our contracts and make an incredibly compelling case that what they were asking for did not at all align with what we had mutually agreed to. I'm confident I could have won that argument. It was so straightforward.
Yeah.
However, instead, what we did was, as you have mentioned a couple of times, David, use the relationship approach first. And really, that's the way you want to try and solve these problems first is,
Mhm.
hey, this is a partnership, Mr. Client, right? This shouldn't be a zero-sum game where you win, I lose. We need to
Yeah.
we need to have a way that we can both win. And
Yeah.
so the short version was, I proposed to them, I can get you what you want, 100%. But here's the help that I need from you to get me what I need in order for this, for me to remain financially whole.
Mhm.
Um, and what I was asking for was not painful at all to them. So they got what they wanted. We got what we wanted. But that again came from a relationship and a discussion versus pulling out the contract.
Yeah. Yeah. Happy story.
It was a happy story.
Related to that, Landon is on YouTube and is actually an attorney. He asked, have you ever engaged assistance in your dispute resolution efforts in hopes to avoid litigation?
Have I ever engaged assistance to avoid disputes? Is that right?
Yeah. So maybe this would be like, hey, what if your lawyers talk to my lawyers before we, go to litigation? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I
Or
mean, I will. I will
maybe
say.
this escalation would be an example of this. I'm not sure.
I mean, I will say that not in this particular case, but I mean, I had a good relationship with legal,
Mm-hmm.
and so getting my legal to help me understand, contractually, you know, if we look at it from a contractual standpoint, what am I entitled to? And if we look at it from the client standpoint, what are they entitled to? In other
Yeah.
words, if we had to pull out the contract, what do the T's and C's say? We should know what that is.
Yeah.
Uh, and I did. There were cases where I did get that understanding, because that would sort of be, if we ended up at that place, I should know what the contract said.
Yeah.
I think, sometimes people view legal as, oh, I got to deal with legal again. I would say legal is your friend.
Mm-hmm.
They have the objective to protect the organization. Sometimes it doesn't feel like you're on the same team, but really you are on the same team. You're trying to grow business or do business
Mm-hmm.
for the organization. They're trying to protect the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I have found legal to be invaluable in supporting me on contract execution.
Yeah. That's good. Um, Landon followed up. He said, for example, a mediator to help uh, to help resolve disputes. Have
We did
Have you
that.
ever had to go
Yeah,
that far?
we've had to go that far once.
Okay.
Uh, um, we were subcontracted, or the firm I was at was subcontracted to another organization.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a disagreement, which was to the tune of about $2 million. And there was a mediator that got engaged
Mm-hmm.
between us and the other firm to try and resolve it before it went to, and that was an external mediator
Yeah.
before it went to court. And we were able to resolve it.
Out of the courts.
Yeah, out of the court.
That's good. Um, so going back to legal, I like that you pointed out how they're on the same team,
Mm-hmm.
even though sometimes it feels like they can slow things down. Right. Um, what are some of your tips about working with? Some of us are at firms big enough where we have legal internally, or even if it's not internally, we hire external legal. What are some of your tips for working with legal?
So we talked about just, understand you're on the same team, even though it may not feel like it some days. And they would say the same thing, by the way. Another thing is recognize that you're not the only internal party that they're dealing with. Their time is sliced up among, many different little, Davids of the world. You're not the only person that they're talking to. Another thing is, to the extent that you can, get all your requests out at once with them. Don't go to them and say, hey, client really has a problem with payment terms. How can we handle that? And then you come back 2 days later. Oh, the client really has a problem with limitation of liability. Oh, 2 days. Oh, it's indemnification. So to the extent that you can, upfront with legal, say, here's the big rocks that I think we're dealing with here. I need your help. Last thing is, and legal and escalation sort of go together. I found that there were some things that there were terms and conditions that our legal had, I'll say, a range of answers that they could approve. And I'm going to take payment terms, for example. Legal could agree to 30-day payment terms. They could agree, as I remember, to 45-day payment terms. But if the client wanted 60-day payment terms, then just understand the answer is not going to be no. It's going to be, we'll have to escalate that. So there'll be a range of things legal can approve, and outside of that, it will involve escalation. That's not a bad thing. It's just normal.
One summary you've mentioned to me before is related to not dribbling in your request to legal, is coming with the language, hey, I think if you can help resolve A, B, and C, we can close this deal.
Yeah, and that's what when I talked about the big rocks, if you will, they will appreciate knowing up front. Because remember, negotiations start with this, this list, and it'll eventually get narrowed down. It'll probably be obvious at the beginning what are the really huge issues that'll cause problems.
Landon, our lawyer friend, he commented, legal should help you figure out how to do something, not relegate themselves to telling you you cannot do it. We can be friendly. And yes, Landon, you're a great example of a friendly attorney who helps make decisions.
Yep, I agree with that. And I would say legal is not the only internal organization that can say, hey, I understand what you're trying to achieve. Let's think about doing it this way instead. I mean, sometimes legal will propose different language.
So we've been talking a lot about statements of work. You did mention earlier a master service agreement or an MSA.
Right.
So when do you think an MSA is necessary? Or what's the purpose of an MSA in addition to SOWs or statements of work?
Okay. Well, understand, first of all, a bit of context, David, that in my 25 plus years, every client I've ever worked with we've had a master services agreement that governed the, I'll say, the engagements that ran underneath that MSA. So I have never been in a client situation where there was not an MSA. So it's a little bit hard for me to answer when do you not need it, because I've never seen that.
Sure. So a good data point for us, if you're dealing with the likes of publicly traded companies, which all of your customers have been, expect that they're going to want an MSA.
I think it's a fair expectation.
They're likely going to want an MSA.
Yeah, I think that's fair, David. I'll say that a sort of interim or a middle of the ground approach is that there are terms that would normally be found in an MSA that you could instead bake into the statement of work.
Sure.
Payment terms is a good example. You could put that in the statement of work.
Hmm.
This probably depends upon how much business you're going to be doing. I mean, the cases, the clients I've been dealing with, David, they are multi-year arrangements.
Hmm.
So having an MSA that you can use to reference over that multi-year relationship makes sense. If you have a project with a client and it's they expect it to be one and done, they probably won't invest the time in an MSA.
Yeah, because that's something their legal has to put time on.
They do, and it typically takes. I mean, the shortest I've ever seen is 4 weeks, and the longest I've seen is 6 months.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'd say from a client point of view, how do MSAs, well, both from client and customer, how do MSAs help both sides of the table?
Um, they help both sides of the table. I would say deal with situations that hopefully never come to pass.
Yeah.
Some could be more likely or possible than others. I mean, for example, solicitation that
Hmm.
that deals with, is David allowed to solicit employees at his client to come work for McCandless Consulting? In
Hmm.
general, the answer is no.
Yeah.
Well, that protects both sides,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. But yeah, some of the typical terms of MSA, like in which court will we resolve disputes? Hopefully you never get there.
Hopefully, you never get there, right?
Hmm. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Are there any other remarks you'd like to share, Dad?
I now I just said David's going to put in the comment somewhere, the document that we have gone through. If people have questions post this, they can reach out to David, and we can hopefully help if necessary. I'd love to have my experience be beneficial to others.
Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom today, Dad. And thanks to those that listened. And